They call it empathy. But Jung called it something else, a survival instinct. You don't feel too much. You've just learned to feel for everyone but yourself. Because once upon a time, that's how you stayed safe. And now, it's how you slowly disappear. You've been lied to about what it means to be an empath. Everything you've heard, everything you've felt, everything society told you about your sensitivity being too much, being broken, being damaged, it was wrong. And Carl Jung knew this. Decades ago. So, here's the truth they don't want you to know. That overwhelming feeling you carry, that sense that you're fundamentally flawed because you feel too deeply, it's not a curse. Jung discovered something that will completely shift how you see yourself. Stop scrolling, because what I'm about to share will change the way you think about empathy forever. Most people get this wrong, but let me show you the right way to understand what's really happening inside you. If you've ever walked into a room and immediately felt the weight of everyone's emotions, if you've been called too sensitive your entire life, if you've spent years thinking something was wrong with you, because you couldn't just turn it off like everyone else seems to, then this message is for you. Jung believed only a rare few ever discover this truth about themselves. And you're about to become one of them. I know exactly what you're going through. That exhaustion from carrying emotional weight that it isn't even yours. The confusion of not knowing where your feelings end and someone else's begin. The shame of being told you're too much, too emotional, too intense. But here's what's about to blow your mind. You were never broken. Not even close. Stay with me till the end, because what Jung uncovered about empaths will not only validate everything you've experienced, but it will show you how to transform what you thought was your greatest weakness into your most powerful strength. The last point is something even Jung himself struggled to explain, and it's the key to everything. Let me start with something that's going to sound crazy, but stick with me. Your empathy, that deep sensitivity you've carried your whole life, wasn't something you were born with. It wasn't some cosmic gift randomly assigned to you. Jung discovered that what we call empathy in its most intense form is actually a psychological survival mechanism. Let that sink in for a second. Think about it like this. Imagine a kid growing up in a house where they had to constantly read the room, where they learned to scan their parents' face before they even spoke, where they developed a radar for emotional danger because their safety depended on knowing when the storm was coming. That kid learned to read micro-expressions before they could read actual words. They became fluent in the language of emotional weather patterns because they had to be. This is what Jung called adaptive hypervigilance. Your nervous system didn't just randomly decide to be sensitive. It made a calculated decision based on your environment. You needed to anticipate emotional shifts to survive, so your brain literally rewired itself to pick up on signals most people miss completely. Modern neuroscience backs this up. Research on highly sensitive persons shows that empaths process sensory data more deeply in brain regions linked to awareness and emotion. But Jung understood something deeper. This wasn't just about brain wiring. This was about psychological alchemy. Here's where it gets wild. You know that feeling when you walk into a coffee shop and you can immediately sense someone's having a bad day across the room? Or when you meet someone new and you just know something's off, even though they're smiling and saying all the right things? Jung called this participation mystique. It's an unconscious identification with the psychological states of others. Your psyche became permeable out of necessity, and now it operates like what Jung termed psychological radar. But here's the kicker. Most empaths spend their entire lives thinking this is a flaw. They think, why can't I just be normal? Why can't I just not care so much? They walk around believing they're emotionally damaged. And that belief, that story they tell themselves, is the real problem, not the empathy itself. Jung wrote something profound. He said the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But for empaths, becoming who you truly are means first understanding why you developed this extraordinary sensitivity. And once you understand it wasn't random, Once you realize it was adaptive and necessary, everything changes. You stop seeing yourself as broken and start seeing yourself as someone who survived by developing advanced consciousness. Don't miss point number 2, because this is where most people have it completely backwards. You're not actually absorbing other people's energy. I know that's what it feels like. I know you've heard 1,000 times that empaths are like emotional sponges, soaking up everyone's feelings. But Jung discovered something more sophisticated was happening. You're not absorbing. You're scanning and processing. Thinking about it like this. When you meet someone and you suddenly feel heavy or anxious, you're not taking their emotion into your body like some kind of psychic vacuum. What's actually happening is your highly developed radar is detecting what Jung called feeling-toned complexes. These are unconscious emotional patterns driving someone's behavior. You're picking up on their unprocessed grief, their hidden rage, their suppressed fear, before they've even acknowledged these emotions exist themselves. Jung identified 3 stages to this process, and understanding them is crucial. Stage 1 is the energetic scan. Your aura, your psychological field, automatically attunes to the emotional undercurrents around you. You sense things, but you're not taking them in yet. You're reading them? Like a psychological metal detector sweeping for buried emotional content. Stage 2 is where it gets tricky. This is what Jung termed unconscious absorption. Because your psyche developed to be permeable for survival, you begin processing these detected energies without conscious choice. This is where empaths get into trouble. They don't realize they have a choice in this stage. They think it's automatic and unchangeable, but it's not. Stage 3 is what Jung called the alchemical process. And this is the game changer. Your nervous system doesn't just scan and absorb. It processes this raw emotional material through what Jung termed a transcendent function. It unconsciously transforms it into wisdom, insight, and healing potential. This is why people feel calmer around you even when you feel drained. Your system has been alchemizing their shadow and reflecting back a more integrated truth. The problem is, this only becomes a strength when brought to consciousness. Without awareness, you become an emotional processing plant running on autopilot, draining yourself to transform everyone else's psychological waste. But once you understand what's actually happening, you can learn to control it. You can choose when to engage this alchemical process, and when to simply observe without absorbing. Here's a real-world example. You're at a family dinner. Your uncle walks in, and immediately you feel this wave of anger. Old you thinks, why am I so angry? What's wrong with me? New you, understanding Jung's framework, thinks, I'm detecting anger. That's his feeling-toned complex. I can observe it without processing it. That tiny shift in awareness changes everything. Wait until you hear number 3, because this is the realization that breaks most empaths free. That feeling of being broken, that sense that something is fundamentally wrong with you. Jung discovered that feeling isn't evidence of damage. It's evidence of awakening. Let me explain what I mean. Jung observed that empaths go through what he called the crucible of consciousness. It's a psychological transformation that either destroys them or forges them into exactly what humanity needs for its emotional evolution. That crushing feeling you've carried, that sense of being too much, too sensitive, too broken to function in the normal world. That's not pathology. That's the beginning of individuation. Individuation is Jung's term for becoming who you truly are, integrating all the parts of yourself you've denied or hidden. For empaths, this process is particularly intense because you're not just dealing with your own shadow, your own rejected parts. You're also processing the collective shadow, the unhealed traumas and suppressed emotions of everyone around you. Think about how this shows up in real life. Maybe you've gone through a period where you felt like you were falling apart, where your usual coping mechanisms stopped working, where You couldn't just smile and carry everyone's emotional weight anymore. That wasn't you breaking down. That was you breaking through. Jung called this the dark night of the soul, and it's a necessary stage in psychological development. Most therapists miss this completely. They see an empath in crisis, and they think this person needs to learn to care less. They need to detach more. But Jung understood the opposite is true. The empath in crisis doesn't need less feeling. They need more consciousness about their feeling. They don't need to shut down. They need to wake up to what's actually happening. Here's what Jung discovered that modern psychology still refuses to acknowledge. Your overwhelming perception isn't a disorder. It's a advanced consciousness trying to evolve. The curse of feeling everything is really the raw material for psychological sovereignty, but only if the integration happens consciously rather than through breakdown. I've seen this pattern play out countless times. Someone who's been the emotional caretaker their whole life suddenly hits a wall. They can't do it anymore. They feel guilty, ashamed, like they're failing everyone. But that moment of collapse, that's actually the moment of awakening. That's when the false self, the one built around serving everyone else's emotional needs, starts to die. And yes, it feels like you're dying too. But you're not. You're being reborn. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. For empaths, this includes accepting that the broken feeling was never about being damaged. It was about carrying programming that told you your sensitivity was wrong, when actually it was your superpower waiting to be claimed. This is the hardest truth to accept, and it's why so many empaths end up feeling isolated. But once you get it, once you truly understand that what you thought was your brokenness was actually your consciousness trying to evolve, everything shifts. The fourth realization is going to challenge everything you've been told about where empathy comes from. You weren't born an empath. I know. You've probably heard your whole life, oh, you're just naturally sensitive. You've always been this way. But Jung's research proved something different. Empathy in its most intense form doesn't come from genetics or some mystical assignment. It comes from necessity. Go back to your childhood for a second. Really think about the environment you grew up in. Were you in a situation where you had to constantly monitor the emotional temperature of the house? Did you learn to make yourself small, to anticipate needs, to read subtle cues, because your emotional or even physical safety depended on it? Were you the kid who could tell from the sound of a car door closing whether mom or dad had a good day or bad day? Jung called this traumatic alchemy. Your trauma, your childhood necessity, literally transformed your neurological structure into something sacred. You developed what modern neuroscience calls hyperactive mirror neurons. Your limbic system became extraordinarily responsive. Your entire nervous system became an emotional antenna. Not because you were born that way, but because you survived by becoming that way. Think about it from an evolutionary psychology perspective. In a threatening environment, the individuals who survive are the ones who can predict danger. The child who can read microexpressions, who can sense emotional shifts, who can anticipate the storm before it hits, that child has a survival advantage. Your empathy was your armor. Your sensitivity was your shield. It kept you safe when you were too small to protect yourself any other way. But here's what nobody tells you. That survival mechanism you developed, it doesn't automatically turn off when you're safe. You're an adult now. You're not in that childhood environment anymore. But your nervous system is still running the same program. You're still scanning, still hypervigilant, still trying to keep yourself safe by reading everyone's emotional state. Except now, you're doing it in situations where it's not necessary. At the grocery store, at work meetings, on first dates. Your alarm system is stuck in the on position. And this is where the guilt comes in. You think, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just relax? Why do I care so much what everyone else is feeling? But there's nothing wrong with you. You're running ancient software that once saved your life. The work isn't to get rid of the empathy. The work is to update the program, to bring it into consciousness so you can choose when to activate it. Jung observed that once empaths understand their sensitivity wasn't a gift from the universe, but a response to necessity, they stop romanticizing it. They stop wearing it like a badge that makes them special. And paradoxically, this is when it actually becomes powerful. Because now it's not an unconscious compulsion. It's a conscious tool. Number 5 is the one most people deny about themselves, and it's probably the most liberating truth Jung discovered. Shadow integration is your actual superpower, not your empathy, your shadow. Let me break this down because it sounds counterintuitive. Jung defined the shadow as all the parts of yourself you've rejected, denied, or hidden. For most people, the shadow contains what they consider their dark side. Their anger, their selfishness, their rage, their desire to say no, their capacity to be ruthless when needed. But here's the twist for empaths. Your shadow doesn't just contain darkness. It contains all the healthy selfish impulses you were taught were wrong. Think about what you learned growing up as a sensitive kid. You probably learned that caring about others was good, that putting yourself first was selfish, that having boundaries was mean, that saying no made you a bad person, that your needs didn't matter as much as everyone else's needs. So, you shoved all those healthy self-protective instincts into your shadow. You buried your anger, your assertiveness, your right to take up space. And now, as an adult empath, you're walking around giving from an empty cup, unable to set boundaries, exhausted from carrying everyone's emotional weight, and feeling guilty every time you even think about putting yourself first. Why? Because your shadow contains what Jung called forbidden selfishness, the natural self-advocacy that was deemed unacceptable in childhood. Jung made a startling discovery about what lies hidden in the unconscious of people with empathic patterns. In the shadow, he found not darkness, but what he termed missing pieces of a complete personality. The empath's shadow contains all the self-protective instincts that got rejected. Your capacity to be ruthless when needed. Your ability to say, no, that's not my problem. Your right to prioritize your own emotional needs. Your permission to walk away from people who drain you. All of that is buried in your shadow, waiting to be integrated. Here's a real example. You're at work and a coworker asks you to take on extra work that's not your responsibility. Old you immediately says yes because saying no feels wrong. You rationalize it. They need help. I can handle it. It's no big deal. But inside you're seething with resentment. That resentment, that's your shadow trying to communicate. It's saying, we have a boundary being violated here, and you're not defending it. Shadow integration means bringing that resentment to consciousness and recognizing it as valid information. It means learning to say no without guilt. It means understanding that healthy selfishness isn't the same as narcissism. Jung observed that empaths who integrate their shadow become what he called sovereign healers. They can give without depleting themselves because they've reclaimed their right to receive. They can care without sacrificing themselves because they've integrated self-care. This is the part where people get scared. They think, if I integrate my shadow, if I embrace these selfish impulses, I'll become a bad person. I'll lose my empathy. But Jung proved the opposite happens. When you integrate your shadow, when you give yourself permission to be appropriately selfish, your empathy becomes stronger because it's no longer compulsive. It's a choice. You're not giving because you're afraid of being seen as selfish. You're giving because you genuinely want to. And that's the difference between unconscious empathy and conscious empathy. The shadow work process Jung outlined involves recognizing when you're triggered, asking what rejected part of yourself is trying to emerge, and slowly giving yourself permission to embody that part. It's uncomfortable. It requires what Jung called moral effort. But it's the pathway to wholeness. Don't miss number 6, because this is where most empaths get stuck for years. Boundaries don't make you cold. They make you sustainable. Jung observed that empaths have a pathological fear of boundaries because somewhere along the line, they learned that boundaries equal rejection. That having limits means you don't care. That protecting your energy makes you a bad person. But this belief is destroying you. Let me paint a picture. You're exhausted. You've been everyone's emotional support all week. Your friend calls in crisis for the third time today. Oh, do you think I have to be there for them? If I don't answer, I'm a bad friend. You thinks I care about them, but I'm depleted. I can't pour from an empty cup. I'll reach out tomorrow when I have the capacity. That's a boundary. And it doesn't make you cold. It makes you wise. Jung distinguished between what he called psychological boundaries and emotional walls. Walls are rigid defenses built from fear. They say, I will never let anyone in because I might get hurt. Boundaries are flexible limits built from wisdom. They say, I care about you, but I also care about myself. I can be here for you without losing myself in the process. Here's the thing about boundaries that Jung understood. They're not about keeping people out. They're about keeping yourself in. When you have healthy boundaries, you're not running on autopilot, automatically absorbing and processing everyone's emotional content. You're making conscious choices about when to engage and when to protect your energy. Think about it like this. You're not a public utility. You're not required to be emotionally available to everyone at all times. You're a human being with limited resources. And just like you wouldn't expect your phone to stay at 100% battery while running every app simultaneously, you can't expect yourself to be emotionally present for everyone without recharging. But here's where empaths struggle. Setting boundaries triggers what Jung called existential guilt. The feeling that, by protecting yourself, you're betraying your essential nature. You hear that voice in your head saying, but I've always been the helper. People depend on me. What if they don't need me anymore if I'm not always available? Jung identified this as the final resistance of the false self. That identity you built around being useful, being needed, being the one everyone can count on. Setting boundaries threatens that identity. And yes, some relationships will change when you start having limits. Jung called this differentiation anxiety. The fear that healthy boundaries will end relationships. But here's what he discovered. The people who truly love you will support your boundaries. The ones who resist them are benefiting from your self-abandonment. This is heavy, I know. But it's the truth. Real relationships survive boundaries. Toxic dynamics don't. And if someone can't respect your limits, they didn't actually care about you. They cared about what you did for them. Jung wrote that you cannot have authentic relationships until you become an authentic person. And becoming authentic requires embracing what he called sacred selfishness. The recognition that you have the same right to care, support, and energy as everyone you've been giving to. The seventh point is the one that makes empaths cry when they finally understand it. The guilt you feel when you start changing, when you start setting boundaries, when you start saying no, when you start putting yourself first. That guilt isn't proof you're doing something wrong. It's proof the false self is dying. And that false self will fight like hell to survive. Jung observed what he termed identity grief. The mourning process for the version of yourself that was never real but felt familiar. You've spent years, maybe decades, being the emotional caretaker. The one everyone calls in crisis. The one who drops everything to help. The one who puts their own needs last. That identity felt like who you are. But it wasn't. It was a survival strategy you mistook for personality. When you start to change, when you start to reclaim your energy and set limits, that old identity starts to die. And it doesn't go quietly. It sends guilt. You're being selfish. You're letting people down. You're not who you used to be. And here's the trap, Tot. You think that guilt is your conscience telling you you're doing something wrong. But it's not your conscience. It's your conditioning. It's every message you received growing up that your needs don't matter as much as everyone else's. Jung called this the collective's resistance to individual development. When you start to individuate, when you start to become who you truly are instead of who everyone needs you to be, the collective pushes back. People say things like, "You've changed. You're not the same person anymore. You've become cold." And they're right. You have changed. You're no longer willing to sacrifice yourself for their comfort. And that makes them uncomfortable. But here's what Jung discovered about this process. The discomfort is necessary. Guilt is part of the transformation. You have to go through what he called the dark night of the soul, where you question everything about yourself, where you wonder if you're becoming a bad person, where you feel like you're betraying everyone by choosing yourself. That's the old programming fighting to maintain control. Think about it like an old computer running outdated software. When you try to update it, the old programs throw error messages. They fight the update because they're programmed to preserve themselves. Your guilt is the error message. Your false self is trying to prevent the update. But if you push through, if you allow the transformation to happen, you get upgraded to a better operating system. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But for empaths, this requires what he called conscious suffering. You have to sit with the guilt and recognize it for what it is. Not moral guidance, but psychological resistance. You have to feel uncomfortable and keep going anyway. You have to disappoint people and survive the disappointment. You have to be called selfish and know in your bones that healthy selfishness is not the same as narcissism. This stage can last months, even years. It's not a quick fix. It's a complete psychological restructuring. But on the other side of it, you emerge as what Jung termed the integrated empath. Someone who has conscious empathy rather than compulsive empathy. Someone who gives from fullness rather than emptiness. Someone who can care deeply without losing themselves in the process. Wait until you hear number 8, because this one completely reframes your purpose. You were never meant to fix everyone. I know that's going to be hard to hear. I know you've probably spent your whole life thinking your purpose was to help, to heal, to save everyone around you. But Jung discovered something crucial. That savior complex, that belief you're responsible for everyone's healing, actually impedes collective healing because it creates dependency rather than empowerment. Let me explain what Jung meant by this. When you constantly step in to fix everyone's problems, when you absorb their emotions and process them so they don't have to, when you give advice and solutions and emotional support non-stop, you're not actually helping them grow. You're preventing them from doing their own psychological work. Jung called this unconscious emotional caretaking, and it keeps people stuck. Think about it like this. Imagine you're trying to learn to ride a bike. Every time you wobble, someone catches you before you can fall. You never fall, so you never learn how to balance on your own. You become dependent on that person catching you. That's what happens when empaths constantly rescue people from their own emotions. Those people never learn to process their feelings independently. They never develop their own emotional resilience. They just learn to call you whenever they're struggling. Jung observed that the true mission of empaths isn't to heal everyone. It's to model conscious feeling, to show people it's possible to feel deeply, while remaining grounded in your own center. When people witness this in you, when they see you processing your emotions in a healthy way, setting boundaries, taking care of yourself while still caring about others, it gives them permission to do the same. This is what Jung called the consciousness bridge. You're not carrying the emotional weight for others. You're showing them how to carry their own weight. You're not fixing them. You're reflecting back their capacity to fix themselves. That's a completely different role, and it requires you to step back from the savior position. Here's a real example. Your friend calls crying about a relationship problem for the 10th time. Old empath, you would spend 2 hours on the phone processing their emotions, giving advice, absorbing their pain. New integrated, you might say, I hear you. That sounds really difficult. Have you considered talking to a therapist about this? I care about you, but I'm not equipped to be your emotional processor. That might sound harsh, but it's actually more loving. You're empowering them to seek proper support instead of enabling dependence. Jung identified what he called the wounded healer archetype. Someone who has been wounded themselves and uses that experience to help others heal. But he made a crucial distinction. The wounded healer who has healed themselves can guide others. The wounded healer who hasn't healed themselves just creates more wounds. You can't give what you don't have. If you haven't done your own shadow work, if you haven't integrated your own trauma, you're not healing anyone. You're just spreading unprocessed pain. This is why Jung emphasized that the analyst must have an ongoing relationship with their own unconscious. They must continue doing their own inner work. Otherwise, they risk identifying with what he called the healer archetype, developing an inflated ego that believes they're responsible for everyone's healing. That's not healing. That's a God complex disguised as compassion. The ripple effect Jung talked about is powerful. When one person in a family system or community achieves what he called empathic sovereignty, it creates consciousness ripples that affect everyone in the system. Your integrated presence gives others permission to stop numbing their emotions and start processing them consciously. This is how collective healing actually happens. Not through one person taking on everyone's pain, but through conscious individuals modeling that it's possible to feel everything and remain whole. Number 9 is where everything clicks into place. Conscious empathy versus unconscious empathy. This distinction is everything. Unconscious empathy is what you've been doing your whole life. It's automatic, compulsive, uncontrollable. You walk into a room and immediately start absorbing emotional content without choice. You feel someone's pain and you can't not carry it. You sense distress and you automatically move to fix it. It's reactive, not intentional. And it's exhausting. Conscious empathy is completely different. It's the ability to feel with others without losing yourself in the process. To sense someone's emotional state and choose how to respond, rather than automatically absorbing it. To care deeply while maintaining your center. To be present for someone's pain without taking responsibility for fixing it. Jung called this psychological sovereignty, and it's the goal of empath individuation. Here's how this shows up practically. You're at a party. Someone approaches you clearly upset. Unconscious empathy mode. You immediately feel their distress in your body. Your mood shifts. You spend the rest of the night processing their emotion. You go home drained. Conscious empathy mode. You notice they're upset. You feel compassion. You offer presence if they want to talk, but you maintain awareness of where you end and they begin. You don't absorb their state. You witness it. The difference is the on-off switch. Jung understood that healthy empathy has what he called conscious, while controlling it. You decide when and how much to engage. You're not at the mercy of your sensitivity. You're the master of it. This doesn't make you cold or distant. In fact, Jung observed that conscious empathy is far more powerful than unconscious empathy, because it serves love rather than fear, consciousness rather than compulsion, choice rather than reaction. Think about the implications of this. Right now, your empathy probably controls you. It dictates your mood, your energy levels, your availability, your boundaries. You're like a boat being tossed by emotional waves with no rudder. Conscious empathy means you become the captain. The waves are still there. The emotions around you still exist, but you're choosing how to navigate them instead of being thrown around by them. Jung identified several characteristics of conscious empathy. First, emotional choice. The capacity to decide when and how much to feel with others. Second, compassionate detachment. The ability to care without carrying, to be present without absorbing. Third, reciprocal relationships. Connections where empathy flows both ways, where you're not always the giver. Fourth, earned security. A deep inner stability that doesn't depend on others' approval or emotional state. This transformation from unconscious to conscious empathy is what Jung called the hero's journey of the psyche. It requires facing your house, shadow, integrating the opposites within you, choosing wholeness over fragmentation. It's not easy. It requires what Jung called moral effort, the daily choice to remain conscious, even when it's uncomfortable. The commitment to observe yourself, without judgment. The willingness to catch yourself falling into old patterns and consciously choosing differently. But here's what's beautiful about this process. Once you develop conscious empathy, you can actually be more present for others, because you're not depleting yourself. You can offer deeper support because you're not carrying their weight. You can love more freely because you're not afraid of losing yourself. Your empathy becomes a gift you give rather than a burden you carry. The last point is the real game changer, and it's the most profound insight Jung had about empaths. Your role in collective healing. This is big. This is the why behind everything. Jung believed that empaths serve a crucial function in what he called collective individuation. That's humanity's evolution toward greater consciousness. In a world that's increasingly disconnected, numbed out, and emotionally shut down, you serve as what Jung termed a consciousness antenna. You feel what others have numbed themselves to. You sense the collective shadow that society tries to ignore. Think about the state of the world right now. People scrolling mindlessly through phones to avoid feeling. People medicating every uncomfortable emotion. People so disconnected from their inner life, they don't even know what they're actually feeling. That's the collective numbing. And in the midst of that, empaths like you are picking up on all the emotional content everyone else is suppressing. You're feeling the grief, the rage, the fear, the longing that the collective is denying. Jung observed that empaths often feel what he called collective disturbances before they manifest in the physical world. You might feel inexplicably sad during global tragedies, even before you know about them. Anxious during collective upheavals. Drained in crowded places where many people carry unprocessed emotions. That's because your empathic field is literally tuning into archetypal energies that transcend individual psychology. You're sensing the collective unconscious, the shared psychological patterns of humanity. This sounds overwhelming, and it is if you don't understand what's happening. But Jung believed this connection to the collective unconscious is both your greatest gift and your greatest responsibility. You're not just here to manage your own emotions. You're here to help transform collective emotional patterns. Not by fixing everyone, but by modeling what conscious feeling looks like. Here's how this works. When you achieve empathic sovereignty, when you integrate your shadow and develop conscious empathy, you become what Jung called a healed wounded healer. You've walked through the fire of psychological transformation and emerged whole. And that wholeness creates ripple effects throughout your entire community, your family system, your social circles. Your integrated presence gives others permission to feel their own emotions without drowning in them. Jung wrote that the most important question in psychological development is whether you're related to something infinite. For empaths, that infinite thing is the collective unconscious. You're plugged into humanity's shared emotional experience. That's why you feel so much. That's why you're so sensitive. You're not just processing your individual emotional content. You're processing archetypal patterns, collective traumas, universal human experiences. But here's the crucial part. You can't serve this collective function if you're depleted, if you're unconsciously absorbed in everyone's pain, if you haven't done your own integration work. Jung was clear about this. The empath, who hasn't individuated, who hasn't integrated their shadow, who hasn't developed conscious empathy, they can't help the collective heal. They just add to the collective wounding. Think about it like being a lighthouse. A lighthouse doesn't jump into the stormy sea to save every drowning person. It stands firm on solid ground and provides light so others can navigate safely. That's your role. Not to drown in the collective emotional storm, but to remain grounded in your sovereignty and provide light through your example. Jung's final insight about empathic consciousness was both simple and profound. The goal isn't to get rid of your sensitivity. It's to make it conscious. When you understand your empathic nature as Jung did, you stop seeing it as a problem to be solved. You start seeing it as a gift to be refined, a tool to be mastered, a calling to be answered. The transformation is complete when you can walk into any room, feel everything that's happening energetically, and choose consciously how to respond. You're no longer at the mercy of your empathic gifts. You're the master of them. You can feel deeply and remain whole, love expansively and maintain boundaries, care profoundly and protect your energy. That's empathic sovereignty, and it's your birthright. So, here's where we are. You started this video thinking you might be broken. Now you know the truth. You were never broken. You were adaptive. Your sensitivity wasn't a flaw. It was survival that transformed into sacred consciousness. Your empathy wasn't a gift randomly assigned. It was a superpower forged in the fires of necessity. Jung believed that minds like yours are meant to lead, not follow. To show others what's possible when consciousness is embraced rather than feared. To model that feeling deeply doesn't mean falling apart. To prove that sensitivity and strength aren't opposites but complements. Your journey from unconscious empath to sovereign healer is the most courageous act possible. It requires facing your shadow, integrating forbidden selfishness, setting boundaries that feel wrong, disappointing people you care about, letting the false self die, and choosing yourself even when guilt screams that you're betraying everyone. But, on the other side of that transformation, you become what Jung called the integrated individual. Someone who has harmonized the opposing tensions within. Someone who has built genuine consciousness. Someone who has achieved psychic wholeness. And in achieving that wholeness, you don't just heal yourself. You create permission structures for everyone around you to heal themselves. Remember what Jung said. Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams? Who looks inside awakens. For empaths, this awakening means recognizing your rare consciousness as sophisticated technology rather than emotional burden. It means understanding that what you thought was your greatest weakness is actually your most profound strength. If these realizations resonated with you, if you felt something shift while watching this, it's because you're remembering something you always knew but forgot. You're not too much. You're not too sensitive. You're not broken. You're rare. And your rarity isn't a burden. It's a bridge to a more conscious world. Tell me in the comments which point spoke to you most. Was it realizing your empathy came from necessity? Understanding that boundaries don't make you cold? Recognizing the guilt as false self-dying? I want to hear your story because every empath who shares their journey makes it easier for others to recognize themselves. And if you want more insights like this, if you're ready to continue this journey of psychological sovereignty and conscious empathy, hit that subscribe button. Because your transformation has just begun. Your sensitivity is not too much. It's your superpower. Your rare consciousness is not a burden. It's a gift. Walk forward with wisdom, with a strength, and most importantly, with the profound sovereignty that Jung knew was always yours to claim.